Hello, detectives. We have another case that has us returning to Japan, the land of online RPGs that almost always focuses more on action, graphics, and power gaming and progression in their games. While we have already covered the founding pioneer in the genre, Phantasy Star Online, being a pioneer in more ways than one for Japan as they brought them online and online on console too, a unique element of their market in fact. We haven't covered the much bigger commercial hit series, though, that spawned from its foundations, Monster Hunter. For reference, while Phantasy Star Online was widely successful for its time by comparison, it made somewhere in the realm of 1 to 1.5 billion over its long life cycle, over like 2 major titles. Compare this to Monster Hunter and you see the difference in scale, as it was able to make well over 8 billion in revenue. The Monster Hunter franchise accomplished this by establishing a working formula. You choose your weapon type serving as your class, party and teammates, usually other players like in Phantasy Star Online, and you choose which monsters you wanted to hunt, as the series name implied. This successful and simple formula has netted the series a bunch of titles, but the series was largely local until the massive success of Monster Hunter World, which dropped back in 2018, and its expansion, Iceborne, which would manage to sell a combined whopping 44 million copies, more than every single Monster Hunter game in sales combined prior. Since then, the series has only largely continued to grow, managing to continue to sell quite well and make a presence that is now known way more globally than just its most popular market in Japan. This was all leading up to their launch of their biggest title yet, or at least the one that was set to be, Monster Hunter Wilds, in the beginning of 2025. While this title would manage to blaze through selling 8 million copies in just a jiffy, it would ultimately peter out at just about 11 million copies sold, a far cry from their last few titles. And since has been rated mixed according to Steam, meanwhile the previous 2 titles there are rated very positive by comparison. The game's population started incredibly positively, and now as of May of 2026 is sitting at less than 2% of the original game audience, having lost the other 98% in just over a year. What went wrong with the most popular ORPG or MMORPG franchise globally, and a founding father of the genre, having been putting out titles in that field for 22 years now? We will find out that and more, including, most importantly, the largest contributing factors to the failure of Monster Hunter Wilds. The Death of a Game series is a series where we investigate the largest contributing factors to a game's death or process of dying by utilizing a timeline of events, filled with clues and bits of evidence. Most importantly, we activate our detective intuition, especially during the final deduction, where we crack the case for good, in case you missed any of the clues along the way. Choose your weapon, detectives. We have some monster hunting to do. The story begins with the ever-growing Monster Hunter series, originally formulated back in 2004 as a largely handheld-focused series, which it would remain for like another 12 years. That was until Monster Hunter World would make its appearance on consoles in the beginning of 2018 before following that up with a PC launch in the fall. Before this point, the series had largely sold the best under the Freedom moniker, a PSP Monster Hunter title that would have as many as like 3+ titles released under it, and well, 3 more if you count Generations as well, and well, eventually Monster Hunter Rise. Why would you count these? Well, that's because the lead director behind those games was the same guy, Yasunori Ichinoshi. This is relevant because in Japanese game development especially, game directors have particular styles and ways of handling titles, and oftentimes alternate from game to game, which can have some serious style and design impacts on the next game. The next leg of the race for Monster Hunter was their 4th iteration, Monster Hunter 4, and the Generation series and of course ultimate follow-ups, which would both prove to be even more successful than the previous Freedom styles commercially. Monster Hunter 4 and all mainline titles were directed by none other than Konami Fujioka, including the more successful previous Monster Hunter 3, which was particularly known for being rather difficult. Following the ultimate release of Monster Hunter 4, Fujioka would shift to the executive art director on both World and Wilds in the future. The lead planner of Monster Hunter 4, Yuya Takuda, would become the next game's lead game director, a developer who originally was a passionate, hardcore Monster Hunter gamer who wanted the game to have more realism and immersion to the series. Takuda was in charge of Monster Hunter World, which would manage to sell a whopping 44 million copies across the base game and expansion, and, well, all platforms. A title that is often accused of being a strong departure from the Monster Hunter series by its fans, as it focused more on immersion and simulation aspects that would be required to hunt monsters properly. The slower and more deliberate combat and positioning was a bit of a turnoff for some with Monster Hunter World, as what came alongside it was a rather difficult game, especially because as you progressed and took on more difficult foes, some gamers being unable to even complete the game's more difficult bosses, a callback to the series' third game, a notoriously difficult one. This was significant because, as Capcom would later confirm, a large amount of the next title in the series' focus would be trying to meet a wider range of players, including cutting down on things like travel times, allowing for auto-travel mounts, and more, as we will discuss later on. Development would start for Monster Hunter Wilds as the next premier title would be dubbed, sometime in 2019 or later, ultimately being in development for about 6 to 7 years before being released. Being developed as well with Capcom's proprietary RE engine, the same one that was used for the majority of the Resident Evil and other Monster Hunter games too. But Capcom wasn't just focused on the next major Monster Hunter title, Wilds. They were also cooking up another Monster Hunter title, one that was a bit more handheld and console focused, of course. Monster Hunter Rise was a return to Yoshinori Ichinoshi of the Freedom and Monster Hunter Portable fame, which was kind of like the majority of the audience, like both literally and historically at that point. Well, of course, up into World. Yasunori liked making his games have simple focuses, where shining in the action combat and overcoming your foe department, there was more about what his main focuses were about. Yasunori games have a distinct action feel to them, and are more approachable on the base level than the other Monster Hunter titles, including from Takuda. Monster Hunter Rise was this taken to the next level, with even more approachable combat systems and a difficulty level as a series title. A more cooperative focused adventure, as it took just one tutorial mission and you could be playing with up to 3 of your friends too. Rise did a lot right, including taking the same seamless map approach that World had made famous for the first time in the series, and then making the game easier and more accessible in some ways outside of that. But there was some early writing on the wall, as the game would demonstrably be easier than World and even prior Monster Hunter games, but ultimately didn't have the same impact as World, as it was essentially just a handheld game or Switch game that was ported to other platforms like the PC. This could even be seen in the game's presentation, to be fair. It still sold massively impressively at 28 million copies sold, including with its expansion Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak, though over half of the game's sales had come from just the Switch. While Wilds was Takuda's game, I think Rise was really worth mentioning because it's the closest comparison to Wilds in many ways, even over World in my opinion, all the way down to the game's base design. Main difference being, on the surface, Wilds was looking to be a serious player on PC, like World was, and taking elements from Rise's design there might have proven problematic because of that. Though it did mimic one major aspect of World's design, which was how progressing through the main story or campaign would be linked to your progress or gameplay in multiplayer, which would prove to be quite problematic later on. Monster Hunter Wilds would be publicly announced December 7th, 2023, being the first time the public really got to see how serious the title was in the production aspects, both in how many high-quality trailers would be churned out and how high-quality the cinematics were for them. Not a whole lot of info was released about the game's actual systems though, and the reason that was significant was that they were introducing many of them for the first time for the series, and by not revealing them before launch, they couldn't really draw upon feedback from that, I would think. And unless they were working through the holidays, I don't even know if they would have enough time to collect the feedback during their Open Beta 1 in October 2024. This beta would only run for 70 hours, and during that time was able to balloon up to an impressive over 460,000 concurrent players on Steam. The success was insane, but the bigger problem was the feedback being given and how little time they were actually going to have to fix things. Wilds, like World and Rise, had an open world, but a much bigger one, with some zones being 2 to 3 times the size from the previous games. This, alongside how the title was clearly highly focused on a high-fidelity graphical presentation, would contribute to some serious performance issues plaguing players since the fall 2024 beta. The next open beta would drop just a few months later, February 15th, 2025, which was just weeks before they were set to launch. Problem was, the performance wasn't fixed, and anywhere from mid-range to high-end PCs were suffering from the CPU-heavy bones of the game, and alongside the high-res texture pack that you would need at least 60 gigabytes of RAM to use. The DLSS system, or temporal upscaling, was also a mess and often required, as it would make your game unknowingly blurry in the process but increase your performance. Even on consoles, Wilds was suffering, as it would even drop from 60 frames in the performance mode, and that was with a scaling internal resolution that could sometimes drop as low as 720p, with the higher quality mode only being able to scrape just 30 frames. Wilds was gorgeous though, but at what cost? Its giant map size and likely high pixel count was causing innumerable performance issues. And considering this was just weeks before launch, there was no way that Capcom could actually alleviate these issues before, which despite the stellar marketing the game had been pushing, would likely lead to a lot of copies bought and then quickly abandoned. Monster Hunter Wilds would launch globally and on all major platforms February 28th, 2025, including where we're going to focus the most, the Steam PC launch. First tackling the critical reception of the game though, which was actually pretty fantastic at 88 out of 100 from 100 plus different critics. For example, IGN Japan was quite high on the game, rating it a 9 out of 10, where they would call its world meticulously crafted and vast, and explain that they had very little complaints about the game, such as just the game's story pacing near the end. IGN Japan enjoyed the noob-friendly system of wounding now added to the game, where you could stun monsters by targeting their weakest parts, and sometimes even repeatedly stun them, making it quite easy for beginners and pretty much everyone else alike. IGN West, if you would like to call them that, would rate it a bit lower at like 8 out of 10, saying it was an obvious smoothing of some traditionally rougher edges of the series, in smart ways in their opinion, and that its flexible combat was some of the best in the series yet. But the critical reviews of Wilds were troubling for many reasons, to put it bluntly. Wilds was a perfect review game, where it was very much designed, more so for the first time, with its narrative-driven story mode campaign, to be beaten by its player base, and completed, which you can do in just like 15 hours, with no difficulty to speak of along the way, really. It was like the perfect video game journalism game. But once you start to evaluate the player reception and reviews of Wilds, you realize that the critics and players had vastly different experiences for some obvious reasons I'm going to outline shortly. On Steam, from 80,000 plus Steam reviews, Wilds was the worst rated Monster Hunter game on Steam yet, at just 69% with a mixed score. The largest complaints largely ignored or unnoticed by the video game media, were that the performance of the game was absolutely abysmal, with some players having extremely powerful PCs still eventually running into performance issues where they would have to clear their shaders after every new update, and worse, being unplayable for those without a spaceship. The next major issue was the difficulty level of the game was non-existent almost all the way through it. Even non-veteran Monster Hunter gamers were claiming that they were able to beat the story without ever dying a single time, and doing it even completely solo as well, which was made significantly easier to make the game apparently more approachable to more kinds of players. And veterans were claiming, according to my sources, that the game was essentially easy mode up until the later updates would add some more challenging fights, and even that was just like 3 to 4 of them at max. The completely disjointed multiplayer and how it functioned didn't make matters any better, which also likely contributed to the players playing more solo. That's because Wilds would also introduce player-driven cutscenes and cinematics for the first time, which was great, being able to actually hear your own voice and have a more integral role in the plot, other than it just being kind of like an excuse to go hunt monsters. There were actual stakes in the story, and characters were more heavily involved. This is a series that was largely essentially just like an extraction shooter, if you want to see it that way, as you would normally in previous Monster Hunter games not even interact with the world at all, and just choose what missions or monsters you wanted to do, and then kind of do battle with them. This means that even if I think the game should have more story in it, many players who enjoyed Monster Hunter as a whole would likely disagree, as it's something that they weren't particularly used to, especially with it being so mandatory and not particularly challenging in Wilds, whereas you didn't have a choice and your friends would get kicked out of your party while playing through the story and transported elsewhere during cinematics. And even having strange quirks like allowing grouping and environment link only to certain areas, blocking off the ability to actually walk around the map and explore, having to reform your group every time instead, which is just strange with Monster Hunter Wilds being an ORPG at its core, and, bragging about having this seamless open world. The actual cooperative experience here was fairly poor in Wilds, which is kind of like a death knell to any online RPG, really. Finally, we should address 2 more major things before we move on with the timeline. That's the combat in Wilds, and the monster preparation or actual hunting parts of the game. The combat in Wilds is a super interesting topic, as is combat in general in the Monster Hunter series. That's because some Monster Hunter games like World or Rise were a bit more deliberate, especially World, with combat and approach to combat scenarios wanting players to pick the right moment to strike and paying attention to monster behaviors and attack patterns properly. Whereas games or series like Freedom or Generations, or even the mainline series in some ways, require far less positioning and were more about straight hack and slash RPGing instead. And that's kind of what the majority of the game's longtime fanbase was used to up into World. But remember, the two most popular Monster Hunter games by orders of magnitude were Rise and World, which had contrasting gameplay styles that some veterans disliked. And personally, I like the combat in World and Wilds. The more intentional combat typically kind of makes me feel that way because you're more immersed into the game. But the problem with Wilds, however, was it was essentially taking too much inspiration from both Rise and World, which despite having similarities in their combat systems were pretty different games overall. Rise was more about grabbing your food, your correct item loadout, and then collecting any spirit birds or spirit birds around the map, which would boost your stats, and getting into the action, rarely needing you to take a pause, heal up too much, or have to rethink your strategy other than just banging on things. That was because Rise was designed by the largely portable focused developer and director, Ichinoshi, who never really seemed to be interested in other styles of combat, whereas World and Wilds were directed by Takuda, who originally was recruited into the franchise with the big goal of making monsters have real noticeable behaviors. In a world with a proper ecosystem, Takuda was more focused clearly on things like immersion and world story. These two clashes would create a problem where if you try too much to be like Worlds or Rise or both, you end up with a game that's quite confused about what it wants to be, which I think is the problem with Wilds. Its combat is fine, I think, and many would agree, but the game is too easy, which makes the combat actually worse, because it removes the need to actually have slower and more intentionally paced combat. What you're left with is an incredibly conflicted combat system, especially when you throw in the second point that I'm going to make, which is how little monster prep would go into the monster hunting in Wilds, which was kind of analogous to the series, largely. In Monster Hunter World and previous Monster Hunter games, this was an integral, unskippable part of the game, and that was after they already started adding many quality of life features with World, such as a base camp allowing you to be easily resupplied. Now, some people, myself included, argue that the over-exaggeration of how much monster prepping goes into the earlier Monster Hunter titles is, well, a bit over the top. Wilds' solution to the problem was to streamline instead of adding new ways to approach the problem, or just making them deeper or more fun. This just ends up being kind of confusing in design, as you basically don't want players to be bothered by monster prepping, yet it still exists in a very streamlined state, almost making it completely trivial. I think Takuda needed to make the choice to expand more of these systems rather than just streamlining them, because if you only streamline and just file away even the sharpest point of a stick, you're eventually gonna run out of stick. And that's the worst thing about Wilds, ultimately, in the end. It's just an oversimplified and filed-down version of the Monster Hunter franchise that happens to have an incredibly alienating multiplayer system and piss-poor performance to boot. It's pretty, even seriously fun at times, but it's just full of warts and all. Warts or not, Monster Hunter Wilds would still manage to blaze past 8 million in sales at a base price of $70. Wilds would reach massive early success, even managing to reach an unheard of 1.1 million players on Steam and a whopping 308,000 players on average. This number within just 1 month, though, would be first halved, and the latter one-thirded. And something I want to address, since I see it commented sometimes on games like this, and well, on my video that was teasing the fact that I was going to cover Wilds, and that's that some people say, well, Wilds shouldn't be considered in the Death of a Game series because, well, Wilds is not a forever game. Even beside that not needing to be a reason for me to feature it, I featured single-player games and companies, but Wilds in every Monster Hunter game ever is an ORPG, a staple in Japanese gaming. And this is one of my favorite genres, being one of the first ones that I just ever played religiously with Phantasy Star Online. It's very much a virtual world, even if it's a heavily segmented one, to be clear. And, well, MMORPGs are also not really designed to be forever either, because, well, they can't be. The engine's graphics and gameplay and systems are going to expire, just like other forms of gaming. It's just us players who have more of an attachment to these games because, well, they're more than just games, they're worlds. Sometimes worlds that we find even more hospitable than our own in real life, so it feels like a forever game. But even with games that are constantly evolving with engines and gameplay, like for example, World of Warcraft, you can see the growing pains and then some, especially with the aging systems. Yakuda and team, including long-standing producer Ryoso Tsuchimoto, who had been a lightning rod for the series but also a long-standing member of it, would promise a series of free updates to hit the game post-launch, organized and dubbed as title updates, with the first to launch April 4th, 2025. This update was pretty good, as it added things like arch-tempered monsters from World, which were much more difficult than the other monsters, or the challenge quest system, which also increased the difficulty of the game. It also added a new high-ranked monster in Zoshia, and a returning one in Mizusuni, who hailed from Monster Hunter Generations. But while it was great to see some returning monsters, the problem with Wilds was it only launched with like 28 large monsters. Meanwhile, Generations, speaking of which, had like 73. These are handheld Monster Hunter games that have oodles of more content and much longer playtimes than Wilds did. It seemed like in the process of reaching a new audience, Capcom had done a poor job of servicing their actual core audience, which was in like the dozens of millions, I might add. Despite this great update, the population would tank even harder after another passing month, reaching just 149,000 players peak and 34,000 players on average. This was seemingly a situation where adding more content wasn't going to fix the sinking ship, which is going to be extra problematic when Japanese development can typically take ages to respond to live feedback like this. Tempered monsters were now placed even in like regular monster herds, and more arch-tempered monsters were added in like Uthduna during the title update 2, June 30th, 2025. But the population was only continuing to plummet, reaching as low as 87,000 players peak at that time and just 22,000 players on average. The updates weren't bad, they just weren't addressing the core issues behind Wilds, or just very slowly addressing them. But some were arguing that perhaps these couldn't really be addressed anyway. Title Update 3 would drop September 29th, 2025, and in my opinion would add the most difficult encounter to the game yet, and that was the unlikely crossover from Final Fantasy XIV. But this was like 7 months after launch, and although it had a positive population movement, with the peak population jumping up about 20,000 players, I think this new difficulty jump was great and much needed, but it makes me wonder how much of it could have helped had it been done earlier. But heavily relying on another titan in Japan, in the case of Final Fantasy, was a trump card that they couldn't just keep playing every single time or potentially ever again. Title Update 4 would drop at the end of 2025, and it would add another fairly difficult monster, Ngogmasios, being a classic Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate monster, more arch-tempered monsters to conquer, and a 9-star version of Dashaguma and Rathalos. These would certainly help with the making of the game more replayable, and help a little to stop the game's incredible burn rate, but the population had an impact from these changes, jumping up as much to like 122,000 players peak. The most challenging update yet would occur just 2 months later, which seemed to be the cadence the game had been largely following regarding updates. This update would add arch-tempered Arkveld, with Arkveld being the flagship monster of the game of course, and now unlocking 10-star quests too. But really, what was most important to me about this update was the fact that it clearly seemed to be a preparation for something larger, perhaps an expansion, as it would finally actually address the game's VRAM issues, shader problems, and overall performance on PC and consoles. It really sucks that this update took a year to formulate, as this sort of update happening even just 6 months prior would have done wonders for the game, but the population would jump up a bit, reaching 85,000 players peak during this time, but failed to maintain that in just 2 more months, with the game's population falling as low as 32,000 players peak in April of 2026. But more importantly than the update in February of 2026 was the confirmation that Capcom, from producer Tsujimoto, had already been working on a quote, large-scale expansion, which was typical for the franchise, who had some rather positive recent expansions in Sunbreak and Iceborne. This was significant because these expansions did a lot to iron out the kinks of the prior games and add far more to the experience and enjoyment. Some players were even feeling like the expansion here in the case of Wilds could make the same major difference. But having spoken to some of my hardcore gamer sources, they told me that unless the expansion can address the core issues that players were having with the game, it's just going to be more things to do in a container that people really weren't totally thrilled about. And it also doesn't feel good to say that even if they do fix it, that the only way to play the fixed Wilds is buying the expansion after buying the base game for $70, so that means like another plus $40. So in total, you have to fork over $110 and wait for a year or more to play an actual good game or completed game. Come on, Capcom. Now, while some players might feel you can't measure the success of Wilds by its player count levels just a year removed, you can for two major reasons. First, if you consider Monster Hunter Worlds' reception and player data on Steam, you see a much different picture. First, as of May of 2026, World has more players playing it than Wild does, both on average and at peak, which is bizarre when the game is 8 years older and isn't producing new content. And during those 8 years never dropped below the current numbers of Wilds, even after 1 to 2 to 3 years in. Worse, as a measure, Worlds sold 4 times more than Wilds at 11 million copies sold, and in all of the past 12 months, Wilds has only managed to sell 1.32 million copies sold. That means that Wild didn't just sell worse than World, it sold worse than Rise, a glorified Switch port, and even sold less than the expansion. Wilds wasn't the hit that Capcom had expected, and there's a strong argument not the hit that they had invested so much money into either. Konami Fujioka is reportedly tasked with working on the next mainline Monster Hunter series, so it will be interesting to see how he, the team, and Capcom in general respond to the reception of Wilds, and naturally interesting to see how they respond to things with the expansion for Wilds, and how much it can really improve the game. But as of now, May of 2026, the timeline has come to an end, detectives. With Wilds having less than 2% of its original audience, it's not totally dead yet, and this video is more so about Wilds, the base game anyway. But I don't think that the expansion will have the same resurrective effects that Sunbreak or Iceborne did for the prior Monster Hunter titles. That's the final reason I decided to feature it here on the Death of the Game series before it was literally dead. But hopefully, you have been paying attention to the clues along the way. But don't worry, in case you missed any of them, why did Monster Hunter Wilds end up rated the worst Monster Hunter game in decades, and the worst selling game in nearly a decade? Serious performance and optimization issues. Caught between two very different designs. Over-smoothing led to a game that was just too safe, and too easy and polished, a lack of content, poor and confusing multiplayer systems. Well, detectives, Monster Hunter is truly an iconic and long-lasting series that has taken many years to end up on the Death of a Game series. Another truly iconic one, am I right? But I feel happy and fortunate to have covered such an interesting series even if their most recent effort fell quite short. Monster Hunter isn't going anywhere. They reportedly have as many as 2 more games in the works, and for players who didn't quite enjoy Wilds, it seems like Rise and World are serving as a great classic game to scoop up some of that runoff. But this case has come to an end, detectives. We have many more to investigate. Let me know in the comments below your thoughts on Wilds and any reasons you think I missed for why it fell so short. Until the next case, one that has quite exploded into the recent news and is a sequel of another online RPG we have already covered.
Times may be dark, but we are Earth's greatest hope. Look around you. A gathering of noble guardians new and old.
Okay, listen up. You're a bunch of dirty misfits, but you're all that's left, so you'll have to do.